Hello, and you are listening to Eco-Justice Radio. We present environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame, featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Eco-Justice Radio acknowledges that we recorded this show on the traditional territory of the Tongva people and all of their relatives in the place we call Los Angeles, California. Welcome. I am Jack Eidt. On today's show, the lithium rush, can the Salton Sea save us? We delve into the issue of lithium mining and the push to mix geothermal energy with lithium extraction in the Salton Sea of the Southern California desert. We feature an interview with Dr. James J. A. Blair of Cal Poly Pomona, as well as multiple news reports, testimony from Preston Arrow-weed, a Quechan-Kamia knowledge keeper, Christian Torres from Comite Civico del Valle in Brawley, and Dr. Ali Sharbat of Cal Poly Pomona. Dr. James J. A. Blair is an author, environmental consultant, and associate professor in geography and anthropology at California State Polytechnic University, Pomona. His work centers on energy, water, and environmental justice, especially related to extractive industries, including mining, fossil fuels, dams, logging, and fishing. Specific case studies include geothermal lithium extraction at the Salton Sea in California, which we will talk about today, lithium mining, hydroelectric dams, and industrial logging in Chile and Argentina, as well as offshore oil and commercial fishing in the Falkland Islands, also known as Las Islas Malvinas. In this episode, we explore the critical role lithium plays in the clean, renewable energy transition, focusing on the potential of the Salton Sea as a lithium-rich resource. Well, there's been plenty of hype from industry as well as clean energy advocates and environmentalists saying this could be the answer to many of the problems with hard rock mining and brine evaporation for lithium around the world. Please reference my interview earlier this year with Dr. Javiera Barandiaran, talking about lithium mining in Chile. Also, check out in our show notes 2 pieces published on PBS SoCal, my project with art-photojournalist Osceola Refetoff called High and Dry, where these issues are illustrated with incredible visuals from both California and Chile. On this show, we discuss the environmental and social challenges, water, indigenous rights, community benefits, and of course the opportunities presented by lithium extraction in this region, using innovative but unproven method undertaken at existing and planned geothermal plants with a process called direct lithium extraction, or DLE. In our third segment, we share an interesting discussion from the 2025 Bioneers Conference around the impacts of clean energy balanced with the urgent need to transition away from climate-wrecking fossil fuels with, well, the venerable Bill McKibben of Third Act and the 350.org co-founder, Colette Pichon-Battle from Taproot Earth, and Ariel Deranger from Indigenous Climate Action. We featured both of them a few weeks back from another talk they did at the Bioneers Conference. Really amazing activists, incredible voices, and, mixed with Bill McKibben, it's an interesting blend there. Join us as we delve into the intersection of technology, environmental justice, and community impact in the pursuit of clean energy. We begin with a report from CNBC from a few years ago to set the stage for all the hype around the Salton Sea. Note the host invokes the environmental disaster of the Salton Sea, but we would phrase it another way. Yes, it faces significant issues, but it remains an important ecosystem as the largest lake in California.
Lithium is powering the electric vehicle revolution. It's the common denominator across all types of EV batteries, and we desperately need more of it, especially domestically. Enter the Salton Sea, a toxic, shrinking lake that's one of the country's biggest environmental disasters due to a variety of circumstances, from water contamination to a decades-long drought. It also happens to be extremely rich in both geothermal activity and minerals. About 40 miles north of the California-Mexico border, the Salton Sea is estimated to contain enough lithium to meet all of the United States' projected future demand, and 40% of the entire world's demand. The area has been dubbed Lithium Valley.
Here at the Salton Sea, it's a phenomenal geothermal resource, but it's a little bit different in the sense that it is a large hydrothermal resource. So what that means is the geothermal fluid comes out actually as a hot brine, not a clean steam.
That brine is used to produce clean energy at the 11 geothermal power plants in the area. And it also contains lots of lithium, which could be recovered without the need for open pit mining or evaporation ponds, just the addition of extensions to the existing power plants.
It will be much, much smaller and less impactful than any of the current ways of producing lithium.
3 companies, Berkshire Hathaway Renewables, Energy Source, and Controlled Thermal Resources, are all developing joint geothermal power and lithium recovery facilities that, if all goes according to plan, will provide clean power to the grid and produce battery-grade lithium. GM is already on board, as it's committed to source lithium from Controlled Thermal Resources. This new industry could be a big boon to the region, where the majority Mexican-American community faces high rates of unemployment and poverty, and suffers health impacts from the toxic dust that blows off the Salton Sea's drying lakebed.
We're cautiously excited in regards to the Lithium Valley. We see it as a game changer here for the Imperial County.
Lithium recovery could provide much-needed jobs, and the increased attention and money flowing into the region could hasten efforts to reduce the dust and clean up the sea.
If they're going to work there and they've invested billions of dollars in extraction facilities that are right next to the Salton Sea, they're going to see something that's positive for the region. Right? Nobody wants to work next to an eyesore.
Extracting lithium from geothermal brines has never been done at scale, but if it works, the Salton Sea could become an epicenter of lithium production, helping automakers meet their ambitious electric vehicle production targets.
All the big autos now are looking for sustainable minerals, and this is cleanest, greenest lithium on the planet.
Next, we have a testimony from Preston Arrow-weed, knowledge keeper of the Quechan and Kamia people of the Southern California, Colorado desert.
In the Kamia story, in this way, up west, there was a big snake, a white snake in the ocean, and he had spots on the snake, but that was a repository of knowledge on that snake, spots. And he came onto the land, underground, and he surfaced where Salton Sea is. That's where Obsidian Butte is too, where the boom, blue came out. He came out to here. The people saw him. Later on, in their ceremony, they have to destroy him. And he circles around the house, and then they cut off his head, destroy him. And after that, they cremate it, and all that smoke of knowledge from the repository of that snake went to all the mountains in our areas, the knowledge. We've been here a long time. That's what this song is saying. Inyawa, we've been here. We've been here for a long time. The Kapipa Kamia song too in this area says Matmuyao, the land you know, Matmuyao, where has been given. Kamsu, the land you know has been given to you. That's what it's saying in this song. That song was made a long, long, long time ago. I'd even venture to say before the Bible was written.
In my case, I don't have a doctorate. I'm not educated in the white man's way that much. I do have some that have, helped me a lot. But I do know 2 cycles of songs that go all night that tell the history. It tells about the journey. It tells about the creation. It tells about, it could talk about the history, geography, and where we've been in theology. It says so many things that I know in these songs that tell me. And for instance, now, on one part, the Kamia, I'm part Kamia. I speak Kamia too. I can speak the dialect. I can speak Kamia and Quechan. But Kamia, my great-grandfather lived in Imperial Valley near New River. My grandmother came from there. They came to here to the Quechan. My grandmother married a Quechan, so we stayed here. They stayed here. Now, there is a story, that I hear about that area. It's a very powerful place where the geothermal scientists say if you keep monkeying around with the geothermal, it will blow. and then it's close to the San Andreas Fault, you can cause a massive earthquake, and that's what they say. But that doesn't stop them. I mean, I know it's true. And lately, there have been some earthquakes and some swarms in this area in Imperial, El Centro. It's starting. It has happened. And I don't know if they can see that. They understand that it's dangerous and went into the Salton Sea. And that snake, that giant snake, and the ancient word, which nobody knew except me, and I learned that from the Kamia, is that it's called a Osceola, the giant snake that came out of there. A Osceola came as a warning. It came to show us how powerful that place is. When he surfaced over there. So I speak more in that area that way than I do the technical way that I see in the lithium. I have lithium liabilities here, untold threat to water in the Russian mine, American gold. Now, water is another thing that come into there. It's going to cause billions and billions of gallons of water, and they're not telling anyone about that. It takes water, and they're in the Imperial Valley. As a matter of fact, the Colorado River is going down all the time with the global warming, and yet they want to use that. When I asked that question a long time ago, they said, we're going to bring the water in. We're going to deliver the water and mine. I said, you don't have enough water to do that. 2,000 gallons a day, even that isn't much. You couldn't do it with that. You're going to need more. And you're going to go to the Colorado or the underground water, which is the aquifers. And that aquifer was meant for the people. And if you use that up, what's going to happen? You're going to have sinkholes, and you're going to have no water, nothing to. If we have thirst, we can't have any water, and the Colorado River is going to go down. And what are you going to do with the people? And they don't think of that, and that really surprises me. That all these educated people with doctor's degrees in their hands, and they're going to help destroy this area.
So we're here with Professor James Blair, and it's Jack Eidt here with Osceola Refetoff. We're looking at lithium mining through the lens of water management. You've done some recent investigations and published some really, what I consider really important and groundbreaking frameworks to understand these projects, as well as to respond to bring community interest together with the big interest of green extractivism of these, using these lithium is so important to the transition to clean energy. So could you define green extractivism, which we could sort of understand what that is, but maybe if you just tell us how this helps us look at this from above.
Sure. So you've been to Latin America. You know that there is a lot of attention on this theory of extractivism because there's so much intensive resource extraction and export economies, right? And so other theorists, for example, somebody named Eduardo Gurinas, has this idea of extractivisms, that basically these are different kinds of economic systems, resource extraction, that have some kind of usually have some kind of deleterious impact on society and the environment. So different kinds of extractivisms could relate to, mining, oil and gas, agriculture. It becomes a bit of a broad concept depending on how it's being stretched. But green extractivism is specifically thinking about, for example, renewable energy, the transition to clean energy and away from fossil fuels. What are the different, minerals and metals that are required for renewable energy infrastructure, solar panels, wind farms, and obviously the lithium batteries that we just mentioned? That all requires a lot of materials. There's a lot of material throughput necessary for that. That requires extraction. And so green extractivism is the way that extractive economy often gets framed as clean and green.
Yeah, interesting. So could you define what hydrosocial means?
Oh, sure, yeah. Basically, hydrosocial comes from thinking about the water cycle differently, that it's not just hydrological, that we need to think about, the social forces that have an impact on our water systems. The couple papers that I think you're referring to, one of them is on lithium in water, which is just a primer, basically, in Wire's Water is the journal. And that paper is really meant to introduce, across the whole life cycle of energy storage, what are those hydrosocial dynamics? So what are both the impacts on water quality and quantity? in the different extraction methods, open pit mining and brine evaporation and direct lithium extraction. But then if we're talking about lithium batteries, also we should be thinking about downstream impacts. So thinking about processing and manufacturing and end of life too. So we tried to, in a relatively short article, just give a summary of what the science says out there on those different stages in the life cycle for lithium and for energy storage. The other paper is called Hydrosocial Imaginaries of Green Extractivism, and that's published in the journal Extractive Industries and Society. That actually came out of a master's thesis from a former student of mine named Alexa Britton, and we co-authored it together with our community partners at Comite Civico del Valle, Luis Olmedo and Christian Torres. And so it's really the outcome of a few years of a close partnership with that organization, environmental justice organization based in Imperial Valley. And the idea is really to look critically at the implications on water supply from the proposed geothermal lithium extraction at the Salton Sea and Imperial Valley.
So, when considering lithium mining through a hydrosocial lens, how can we arrive at, what, I don't know how to call it, the sweet spot of balancing environmental versus economic? So, you've got a number of stages and different things. I think the hydrosocial imaginary study sort of laid it out really well. Could you give us the brief version from above? Because I think it's really important. We need to understand right now that there's a lot of focus on the Salton Sea as being the answer to, and we can talk about questions of Chile in a bit here, but
sure.
A lot of folks are saying it's the environmentally responsible version of lithium mining, and it's also based in the United States for the U.S. economy to have something in the country to develop. But there are impacts, and there are communities nearby, and there's an impact to water as well. So if you could give us the general theory of this view.
Sure. So maybe first, just as a baseline, some context on the conventional methods of extracting lithium.
Yeah, thank you.
And then what are the implications for this kind of novel technology called geothermal direct lithium extraction at the Salton Sea? So the way lithium generally is produced around the world is basically two ways currently, right? Conventional open pit mining that is especially produced in Australia, also in other places, but primarily Australia. And that's actually the main way that lithium is currently produced, from these hard rock pegmatites called spodumene. And then, in South America, as you know, there's often a different method used called brine evaporation. And that's really interesting because lithium and water have such an intimate relationship there, because really we're talking about extracting a liquid, not a solid. The implications for water from open pit mining are pretty well understood. Groundwater impacts, tailings dams collapse, right? There's all kinds of problems with contaminating waterways. With brine evaporation, there may be concerns about contamination, but primarily it's a concern about water scarcity and water supply. And the main concern is about, if the operators are pumping lithium up from beneath this salt flat at a rate of, 1,700 liters per second, 95% of brine is evaporating. Well, what's happening under the surface, right? Is it possible that there are inflows of fresh water coming from the hillside that are entering the salt flat and replacing all that pumped brine? And so is it exacerbating water scarcity in this desert, which is already one of the driest places in the world? And what does that then mean for all these fragile wetlands and lagoon ecosystems that are surrounding the salt flat? And what does it mean for indigenous peoples that rely on springs and wells for raising livestock or growing crops? So there's a lot of unknowns there. And, I've advocated for a precautionary principle related to brine evaporation. It's been happening for decades, but it's not well monitored, mainly because water in places like Chile is treated legally as a mineral rather than as water, right? In terms of the way it's regulated. So there's been heightened concerns over that in the past several years. And there's also a lot of attention on lithium because of the rising demand for electric vehicles and renewable energy storage, the need for batteries. So a lot of people have been advocating instead for an alternate technology called direct lithium extraction. And direct lithium extraction it can be one way of describing several different kinds of, electric or chemical or physical methods, ranging from adsorption or ion exchange, membranes, electrochemical processes. So depending on which method they're using, it could have different kinds of impacts. It could use more water or more acid and more energy, right? So what they're proposing at the Salton Sea in Imperial Valley, California, with the proposed Lithium Valley Development Project, is basically to pair these direct lithium extraction methods with geothermal energy production, right? There's been 11 or so geothermal plants that have been operating, some of them for decades in that area near the southeast edge of the Salton Sea. And so what they're proposing now is basically the way that works, right, is they bring this very hot geothermal brine. So it's different from the continental brine that you see in South America that's really close to the surface. And instead, they're bringing this really hot geothermal brine that's far beneath the earth, maybe a mile or more, up to the surface. When it gets to the surface, it flashes steam. Steam turns turbines that generate electricity, right? And it's considered closed loop or renewable form of energy production because after the brine cools, they re-inject it into the same underground deposit. Now, what they're proposing is to pair direct lithium extraction technologies with geothermal energy production. So what that would mean is that before they re-inject all that brine, they would directly extract lithium using one of those methods I mentioned. And so, again, those methods have different implications in terms of water, acid, energy use. And there are studies that have now shown that even though advocates, even like, myself in the past, because of all the concerns with brine evaporation, have advocated for direct lithium extraction, I've always said that there's a need also to monitor the water use and also the waste streams. Now, there are studies that show that direct lithium extraction may actually have 10 times as much freshwater use as conventional brine evaporation. Now, the reason that is because even though it doesn't involve these massive evaporation ponds, and it's not necessarily evaporating the brine, instead, they need to use a lot of fresh water directly for a lot of washing and rinsing, basically.
You're listening to Eco Justice Radio, a listener-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org or SoCal350.org. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon at patreon.com/EcoJusticeRadio. Today, you're listening to The Lithium Rush and the Salton Sea Save Us. I'm your host, Jack Eidt, and we feature a discussion on lithium mining in the Southern California desert with multiple advocate voices and Dr. James Blair of Cal Poly Pomona. We feature another report from PBS NewsHour with Stephanie Tsai traveling to the Salton Sea.
In the most southeastern stretch of the Southern California desert sits a most unusual piece of the planet. It's like a Dr. Seuss book with sound effects.
Oh, it's fascinating. What we're hearing is what?
CO2.
Carbon dioxide is generated by reactions between superheated salty water called brine and rock deep in the bowels of the earth. Geologist Michael McKibben says the brine is full of lithium.
The attractiveness of geothermal brines and oil-filled brines is that the plumbing system is already there. The fluid's already being brought up.
This sound of the gurgling
is the sound of bad plumbing.
It's the sound of economic opportunity. Since the 1980s, companies have tapped into the hot brine for geothermal energy. It would take just a few more steps to recover the lithium in the used brine. Today, the U.S. sources most of its lithium from South America and processes it in China. But what if the supply chain could all be right here? It's a natural twofer.
And could supply all of the U.S. needs of lithium, could come out of this geothermal field.
The Salton Sea area alone could produce nearly 6 times the lithium currently produced globally. And McKibben says the way it could be done here would be less harmful to the environment than other methods, such as crushing it out of hard rocks. The only barrier remains affordable technology that can extract lithium efficiently at a massive scale. A newer player in town, Controlled Thermal Resources, has been testing their lithium extraction protocols in the area known as Hell's Kitchen.
We have a process. It
Okay.
works great.
Is the process scalable?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Chief Operating Officer Jim Turner says the plant was designed to reuse and recycle as much as possible, including the water that's needed to separate lithium. For every ton of lithium produced, some 50,000 gallons of water will be needed.
And as evidenced by the shrinking Salton Sea, water is increasingly scarce here. What does come from the Colorado River mostly goes to municipalities and agriculture, the economic backbone of the valley. You do think that if Colorado River water really starts to go down, that there could be a little bit of tension there?
There probably will be a lot of tension. There already is. That's a very difficult problem to solve.
We are experiencing the worst drought in modern history, that I don't even call it a drought anymore. I call it the new normalcy, because the water is simply not here.
Frank Ruiz is the Salton Sea Program Director for Audubon, California, and sits on the state's Lithium Valley Commission. He says the ecosystem, a crucial habitat for millions of migratory birds, is near collapse.
This is probably one of the worst environmental crises on the West. In California, we lost over 97% of the wetlands in the last few decades, either to the agricultural industry or to urban developments.
Lithium extraction here could easily grow to a multi-billion-dollar industry that drives the transition away from fossil fuels.
If California is going to electrify every single vehicle by 2035, we're going to need every piece of lithium we can get. And I understand the sense of urgency, but we also need to be careful not to rush it in a way that we're going to be cutting corners here.
Back to our interview with Dr. James Blair from Cal Poly Pomona.
So what they need to do is strip the lithium ions from these sorbents, and then they need to wash off acid, and they need to regenerate these resins. That all requires a lot of water. One example where, concretely, there's not a lot of, I should say that mostly this is in research and development stage for pairing it with geothermal, but DLE does exist in other places in the world. So for example, in Catamarca, Argentina, in the Hombre Muerto salt flat, so it's now owned by Rio Tinto, or they're just acquiring it. But previously it was Arcadium, and before that Livent, and before that FMC has this project called Phoenix project. And the Phoenix project is kind of unusual in that area of South America because it's not just using brine evaporation, although it does use brine evaporation for concentrating brine before and after their extraction process, but they actually use direct lithium extraction. They have a selective adsorption plant, and in order for that selective adsorption plant to run, they need a lot of fresh water. So that's actually resulted in the damming and depletion of this river called the Trapiche River. And it dried up the entire surrounding meadows, 7 square kilometers of a surrounding meadow around the Trapiche River, which also displaced indigenous community members who had been using that area to raise livestock. And so it's kind of a cautionary tale in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it's a really interesting precedent because the Atacameños del Altiplano indigenous community was able to actually file a lawsuit. And they actually had a favorable ruling in the Supreme Court of Catamarca last year in March of 2024, saying that expansion of almost, more than a dozen different projects, not just Project Phoenix in that area, that they're not allowed to expand, they're not allowed to have new projects until a really comprehensive cumulative impact study is done. Now, this has implications for the Salton Sea, because the Salton Sea is an area that on the surface you might think has access to a lot of water. There's a lot of historical precedent for California compared to neighboring states like Arizona and Nevada in terms of how much control it has over the Colorado River water, right? And so a lot of that Colorado River water enters canals that reach Imperial Valley that are used primarily, 97% or so, for agriculture, right? And so a small percentage is reserved for non-agricultural uses, just 25,000 acre feet per year for industrial non-agricultural uses. And this is a concern in particular in this area because the Salton Sea is rapidly receding. Not just and well, Colorado River's in drought, right? And that's a drought that is exacerbated and prolonged because of climate change. And the Salton Sea is rapidly receding, not just because of climate change, but also because of different water diversions that have occurred, right? So the Quantification Settlement Agreement in 2003, it diverted a lot of water that would have ended up in the Salton Sea to cities like San Diego and LA. And so that has meant that the Salton Sea which is, an important wetland for migratory birds, but it's also mainly an agricultural sump that basically absorbs lots of agricultural runoff, which also results in, algae blooms and lots of health hazards. But now it's rapidly receding, and so that's exposing a lot of the shoreline called the playa. And all that playa is getting whipped up into the atmosphere, and it's causing a lot of dust pollution. Dust pollution together with this toxic lake spray with all this bacteria in the Salton Sea is causing really high rates of asthma and respiratory and also cardiovascular illnesses in this area. And so this is an area that on the one hand has this environmental problem. It also has high rates of poverty and unemployment. Primarily, a lot of the population is Mexican migrant farm workers and their families. And because of that, there's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm for the possibility of jobs and economic development. And so even the groups that are especially concerned about environmental justice or environmental health are not necessarily opposing these projects because they know that there's so much interest in jobs and economic development.
Here's testimony from Christian Torres from Comite Civico del Valle, frontline environmental justice organization from Brawley, California, which is just adjacent to the Salton Sea.
So I'll start by setting a little bit of the landscape for those unfamiliar with the Imperial Valley. The Imperial Valley is located smack dab in the middle of very huge environmental concerns, one of them being the Salton Sea, which has had reduced outflows to it over the last couple of decades. It is exceedingly drying out, and a lot of what has been deposited there from the last 100 years is now being exposed. So this exposed playa is a concern to all the communities that are living close by because we have strong winds, we have these exposed materials, and now they're being blown into these communities that don't have the best access to healthcare or direct access to emergency services sometimes. To the south of that, in the Imperial Valley, we have the international border. In the international border, at the onset of the 90s, there was a huge boom in manufacturing. Now, this manufacturing is less enforced as it is in the US, but it is right smack in the border. We have a huge port of entry that brings a lot of materials, causes a lot of traffic and emissions for a community in the south of the Imperial Valley. So it encompasses both of them together, and we have a lot of concerns from the residents here. And that's where the movement for environmental justice rises up. And the fact that a lot of these issues can be resolved if we take care of our environment and environmental health issues. The Imperial Valley, even though it has this important role to play by being on the border, by now being targeted as a place for an energy transition mineral, has had a lot of underinvestment over its history. We have been ignored or underrepresented in programs that should be benefiting everybody in this area. We are next to San Diego. San Diego is a huge metropolitan area where a lot of the resources end up, and then they get to tell Imperial like how much you can get or how much you deserve. And we've lived that through a lot of emergencies, a lot of scenarios. And recently, that's what caused a lot of issues during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. Through that, we saw a lot of rising movements in the Imperial Valley working towards environmental justice because we knew we deserved better. We know everybody deserves a right to live a healthy and clean life. And now we're at a crux where there is this generational opportunity that companies that are not all from the Imperial Valley, we have three major players, Controlled Thermal Resources, Energy Source Minerals, and Berkshire Hathaway Renewables, coming into this area. And they have operated geothermal facilities, some of them in the past. They have generated energy. And yes, we know that renewables is a change that is going to happen as we lean away from fossil fuels in this fight against climate change. But now you're adding a new process, and a process that hasn't been proven to the scale that they're trying to do. Adding this process is going to require, as Preston said, a lot of water to be used. That is a big elephant in the room that I think we all, in the environmental justice movement here, and a lot of communities that are directly living and seeing this nearby, have asked. We need to know how that is going to be planned for the future.
Dr. James Blair.
At the same time, there are a lot of concerns about water use. What are going to be the cumulative impacts on all this water use for the direct lithium extraction, all that washing and rinsing? And not only that, it turns out that the water use impacts are even higher because it's paired with geothermal energy, because geothermal energy requires also a fair amount of water itself for the cooling towers and for diluting brine before it's re-injected.
Now, you said it was a closed loop system, but does that mean everything that's being pumped up is being returned, or is there a waste?
Great question. So there is definitely waste streams that are also serious concerns. And even though it's framed as a closed loop system, there's quite a lot of solid waste in particular that is produced through this geothermal energy production process.
This is just geothermal. This is pre-DLE lithium extract.
That's right. Although if you look at, for example, there was a report from Berkeley Lab not long ago that has a chapter on solid waste. They anticipate that there will be significantly more solid waste as a result of pairing DLE with geothermal.
Yeah.
That solid waste is often referred to as geothermal scaling or filter cake material. That filter cake, or iron silica filter cake, they call it, it is primarily silica, and which is kind of the companies will sometimes say, well, it's similar to sand. A lot of it ends up in landfills locally. But if it reaches a threshold for hazardous waste, then it goes to the Copper Mountain facility for hazardous waste in Arizona, or in the Central Valley, Kettleman City, Buttonwillow, those places that are already, of course, very much overburdened in environmental justice communities. And the reason it can be hazardous is because just this solid waste happens to have lead and arsenic in it. And so these are waste streams that really need to be mitigated. I'm actually working on a pilot study right now with a chemist colleague at Cal Poly Pomona. We just have a seed grant from California State Universities. But what we're proposing to do is to synthesize other materials from that geothermal solid waste. For example, zeolites. So you may know that zeolites are minerals that can be used for a variety of different secondary applications. For example, retaining water for irrigation efficiency. So it can be used as a soil amendment, in other words, that way. It has the capacity to absorb lead and other heavy metals. So it can be used for remediation too. So this could be a cyclical, a kind of more circular approach to waste management that we're very interested in and trying to, assess the feasibility of that.
Next, we hear from Dr. Ali Sharbat of Cal Poly Pomona.
Direct lithium extraction is being introduced, and the companies are doing developments in that field. The composition of that brine is going to be changed by some chemical processes. So there are different technologies, and the companies are not willing to share which technology they prefer and they would like to push forward. They don't disclose information on that regards, the type of technology for direct lithium extraction. So we don't know what they're gonna inject back underground. And that's the scary part, because there might be changes in the chemistry. I mean, there will be changes in the chemistry of that brine matrix, but we do not know what are the environmental impacts of those changes, because there's no information. We can't assume it is safe. My concern, I'm an environmental engineer, so my concern is not only the seismic. It's hot water. So hot water is exposed to some polymers in the process, in the extraction process, like some resins. There will be traces of these resins, of these plastics in that hot water. Like, we don't pour hot water in plastic cups. Why? Because of that. So in the volume that they are envisioning to do these processes, there will be a lot of hot water exposed to, I'm just putting it in simple language, exposed to plastic, and simply we don't know what's going to happen. And certainly there will be changes in the composition. So this is what we know.
Well, so the way, in terms of getting back to the Salton Sea community, there's the concept of engagement, consultation. There's the concept of how taxes might be distributed. And then there's the necessity of a community benefit agreement. So could you explain those?
Yes. Well, you've already done stories, on some of the concern around tribal cultural resources. You're well aware of, right? The Obsidian Butte, the mud pots, the mud volcanoes in this area. There are all these different volcanic features of the landscape that tribes, for example, the Quechan tribe, and particularly an outspoken tribal elder and monitor named Carmen Lucas from the Quime Laguna Band of Indians, has also, expressed a lot of concern about how to protect these tribal cultural resources if they're in very close vicinity, a matter of feet, not miles, from geothermal plants. And so what she's proposed is to register in the national and state historic registers a new cultural district called the Southeast Lake Cahuilla Active Volcanic Cultural District to really protect these tribal cultural resources. This has been she's had to be very proactive, and so have the Quechan tribe members, because the way that tribal consultation and consent has worked in this area has often not been timely or adequate. And so that's been an ongoing concern, both especially with Imperial County, but also this has been an ongoing dialogue through the permitting process for some of the new geothermal plants that were under review with the California Energy Commission. Until recently, they were suspended. So in terms of engagement and outreach, that should be a priority, just in terms of being consistent with our AB 52 California state law, as well as the international law, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
And here we have a brief clip from Daniela Flores from the Imperial Valley Equity and Justice Coalition out of Calexico, California.
In our county, we have the highest child hospitalization rates due to asthma in the state. We have some of the most polluted air, and we'll talk more about sources. But of course, a lot of it comes from the industry, the agribusiness here, trucking vegetables out of this county. And a lot of it being the hay, which is one of the biggest producers, and water users, right? That gets even exported into Saudi Arabia and to other places all over the world. Our county, we have one doctor for every 4,000 residents. The north end, the communities of Nyland and Calipatria that are nearby, Nyland's elementary school is only 3 miles away from the controlled thermal resource plant. And in the environmental review, folks said that it wasn't a significant distance, that it was 3 miles was not of concern, but we believe that it is significant, and the impacts that Jared has mentioned are to be taken very seriously. I'll say, time and time again, because our community has one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation, they often pin jobs against our livelihood. They say, oh, this will bring jobs, so that's why you need to accept this in your community. But we're tired of that. Yes, we need jobs, but there are a lot of residents in our community that don't believe that we need to just accept jobs at the expense of our health and the environment that we breathe, the air that we breathe. We're promised jobs when the prisons came in, and now we have 2 state prisons and 1 detention center that houses thousands of people. We have a highly militarized economy here in Imperial Valley, and we want to see things differently. We want to see an economy that is not based on violence, and that is, focused on healing our environment and protecting our human bodies. We see humans and residents living in the area more than just workers. We see them as humans that deserve clean air to live healthy lives here. We believe, like Mr. Preston shared, we believe that we shouldn't just open the floodgates open to all the extraction, right? If we are to be one of the main sources of that lithium, we want to make sure that it's not just limitless and that they just take, and we want to try to preserve most of the natural state of our planet that we can, right?
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying Eco-Justice Radio. Stay connected by subscribing on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and listen to extended episodes. Get connected with us on social media. Today you're listening to The Lithium Rush, Can the Salton Sea Save Us? I'm your host, Jack Eidt, and we feature a discussion on lithium mining in the Southern California desert with multiple advocate voices, Dr. James Blair of Cal Poly Pomona. Here's a panel discussion clip from the 2025 Bioneers Conference between clean energy advocate Bill McKibben and frontline activist Colette Pichon-Battle and Ariel Deranger.
If the answer, and if the question is there a magic way to run a world of 8 billion people that requires no anything to make it happen, then the answer is no, there isn't. So the question becomes, what's better and what's worse, and how do you do this? I was quoting earlier today from the Rocky Mountain Institute saying that the amount of mining that we have to do to get enough minerals for the energy transition through 2050, the battery transition, is the rough equivalent of how much coal we mined last year on this planet. Okay. One way to hold this in your mind is that 40% of all the ship traffic on planet Earth is carrying coal and oil and gas back and forth across the oceans to get burned. That gives you some sense of the dematerialization that comes as you move towards renewable energy. It's not perfect, and we should do everything we can. When I wrote about this, I said recently, I think it's high time for white people, old white people like me, to stop suing, to stop solar panels and wind turbines and stuff going up. But that I thought indigenous communities who had paid the price for every other industrial revolution that there ever was were on completely firm ground in saying no. The good news is that in the last 2 years, we've discovered an almost endless number of sources for things like lithium. So for instance, the Salton Sea in California, it turns out, has the brine that's coming up out of the geothermal plants there now is a source of almost infinite quantity of lithium, as we're now quickly learning how to do. But if you want to be told that nothing's ever going to go wrong in your heart, whatever, then that's what heaven's for. On this planet, things are, we make choices. Now, I just want to return, though, to this question of power for a moment, and to this really interesting discussion that's been going on. None of this is going to happen in time to make a difference around the climate crisis that now is engulfing this world and is going to swallow up every one of the communities that we have been discussing in short order unless we get it under control. None of this transition is going to happen in time unless we make it happen. From my point of view, I think when people look back on the 20th century, they'll identify two great inventions. One is the solar cell, and the other is the kind of odd technology of the nonviolent social movement that had a lot of antecedents, but really sprung up on the margins around the world in the 20th century and became a way for the small and the many to take on the mighty and the few. We badly need it now, and we're going to have to leverage the desire of human beings for a different world in many, many ways. But one of them has to be to change the material basis of that world. Right now, the material basis of the planet on which we live is coal and gas and oil. And if it lasts very much longer as the material basis of our planet is going to literally crack under the strain. So our job is to figure out, and it is our job. This is not a job for some leader. It's not going to it is, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen because we build a movement and make it happen fast. And if we do that, as I said earlier, I think the best other outcome of that will be a chance at cracking open the power structure of this world too, along the way. But it's going to crack in the other direction if we don't do it and do it quickly.
we gotta pause, because the question implies, how do we transition without having to experience any kind of discomfort? I mean, the truth of the question is, we could consume less. We could consume less. One American uses as much energy as 360 people in Ethiopia. 360 people. One American. One American. The things that we are scared to live without, people are living without them. We are literally asking a question. I'm getting nauseated with this. How do we move without discomfort? How do we maintain our lifestyle and save the planet? What can we consume and gather better than the other thing? We're still maintaining a position of superiority and colonization here. You've got to be willing to change that. This is the moment for you to say you cannot uphold this system. You don't get to be comfortable anymore. The world has been uncomfortable for a very long time so that we can have lots of beautiful, comfortable things. We have caused an imbalance to the planet. At what point do you say it's our turn to be accountable? At what point do you say we don't just get to grab more stuff from wherever? From wherever. This is sick. No. It's us. It's us. It's all of the privilege. It's all of the incomes. It's all of the degrees. It's all of the things you have. It's that big old house, the other house that you got, the 2 cars that you got, the 12 kids that you got, that all have cars and houses. That's the problem. That is the problem. This is not where do we find other materials to extract. Wake up! Oh my God! The solar panels are causing war around the world. The windmills are causing war around the world. Black people are dying for your solar panels and your cell phones. You do not get to keep going. You do not. You do not get to keep doing this and asking the question, how do you get to be comfortable? Keep your stock prices, keep your retirement, keep your security. It's all false. It's all fake. It's unreal. You have got to be willing to be uncomfortable. You have got to be willing to see that as a collective US, we are a part of this problem. And we can help solve this. When COVID happened and everybody had to stay home for a week, the whole earth started repairing itself. When we stopped, the water in Venice, the air in India, all of this stuff cleared up because the humans just stopped. Hey, stop. That's what's happening. That is what this conversation about how do we continue to consume the right way. Oh my God.
Colette, when COVID happened, everybody did stop. We had the biggest, it's more than any environmentalist would ever have imagined. Nobody traveled, no one went anywhere. And emissions did drop, but only about 10% around the world, which for me was the kind of reminder that a lot of this has to do with what's in the guts of this system. Now, everybody's plotting, and yet my guess is that actually nobody's going to go home and dramatically change how they're living. And if the thing we have to do over the next few years is somehow convince everybody in the world, including Ethiopians, to want something entirely different from what they have now, my guess is we're going to lose. That the temperature of the planet's going to go through the roof, and that the victims of that are going to include, in fact, be first the people who are poorest and most vulnerable on this earth. So in the world that we live in, it seems to me wise that we figure out how to take advantage of the fact that the sun is pumping out energy for us. The alternative is not, I don't think, and I think if you think about it in our political system, I don't think the alternative is going to be dramatic shifts in people's lifestyles. I think the alternative is going to be we're going to keep using coal and gas and oil straightforward, straight through, and we're going to burn up the planet in the process. That's my guess.
My suggestion was to tell the truth.
Yeah.
That's my only suggestion. Let's not act like we don't know what the answer to the question is. Yeah. That's all I'm saying. Well, what we choose to do is one thing. But the answer to the question is consume less. The question was, how do we do this and not move on? I'm saying that we know the answer. It's not just a difficult answer. I'm not saying convince people. I'm saying tell the truth.
Well, I think that's fair, and I think that there's several truths here to be told.
I think the reality is that multiple truths can be held in simultaneous positions. We know this. I had the opportunity to sit with Gudji Cook, who was one of the opening keynotes on the first day, and we were chatting, and she said to me, I think the problem is that we are in a social crisis. And we require a social reawakening in order to move through this. And as we talk about the power of the sun and renewable energies and the issues of consumption by people that are putting other people at risk and human rights being violated over and over again, these things can be true. But I also need to caution you that I said colonialism is the root cause of these problems, white supremacy, capitalism. The systems that drive our political economic systems have allowed us to have the cognitive dissonance to drive the climate crisis and the social crisis simultaneously. When we talk about addressing the energy crisis, the climate crisis, we have to hold it in the same simultaneous passion and work to drive both change for the same social crisis. We have to talk about undoing what white supremacy and colonialism has done to our minds to believe that it's man's right to have dominion over nature. Because otherwise, we are going to usher in green colonialism. So we have to, with the same level of urgency that Bill is saying we need to usher in renewable energy systems, we need to be demanding that same urgency for the upholding of human rights, of the rights of Indigenous peoples and the rights of nature simultaneously. We have to treat this as a poly-crisis and the poly-crisis that it is, and we have to think about what it means to restructure our entire democratic system. We need true decolonial movements around deconstructing these systems to build something that holds everything in the balance. Thank you.
To sum things up, we have Osceola Refetoff, photojournalist from High and Dry, PBS SoCal, cohort of mine, asking the crucial question of Dr. James Blair.
I have a question, because this is an article ostensibly about lithium on a larger scale. I think the big question that we're looking to answer is, as we transition to a green energy structure, like lithium is going to play a large part in that, and people are going to be interested in knowing, well, which lithium is the better lithium? Where are we going to get the lithium? I know that recycling lithium is a very important part of that, future plan. But in the meantime, is there a way to know or comment on whether the lithium extraction in Australia, the hard rock, versus what's happening in the playas in Chile versus what's happening here? Is there a good lithium extraction?
I think the short answer is no. When I was working more closely with communities and advocacy groups in Chile, working on this issue of lithium mining, DLE there wasn't a lot of understanding about it. There was this legal case happening that I mentioned in Catamarca, but there aren't a lot of strong examples of what DLE would be like on a commercial industrial scale on its own. And there was a lot of hope at that time, this is just a few years ago in 2022, that could be a viable alternative. You had groups like Nature Conservancy, for example, really promoting DLE as kind of the green and clean solution. Geothermal DLE also sounds great because it's pairing renewable energy with an alternative that is not open pit mining or brine evaporation. DLE may not have the same land use as brine evaporation or open pit mining. It may not be as violently extractive as open pit mining, for example, in particular. But unfortunately, the science tells us right now, with several life cycle assessments that have been done recently, that the impacts in terms of climate, greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of water use, and in terms of energy demand, depending on the technology and the energy source, show that DLE actually has higher impacts in those categories than brine evaporation. So this is unfortunately a major problem right now because you have a lot of DLE being proposed as the solution. in places like Arkansas, where there's oil field brines at the Smackover Formation, where, companies like ExxonMobil, besides other companies like Albemarle and, Standard Lithium, Equinor, oil majors are now in there as well as big lithium companies. And so they're interested in using DLE there. That's an area that may not have the water scarcity drought problems that we have here in the Southwest, in California. So maybe the water supply issue is less of a concern, but it certainly is a concern in places like Nevada or Utah or, Imperial County, California. There are other concerns about contamination too, right? So DLE also uses more chemicals, and depending on the composition of the brine and its impurities, it may require quite a lot of chemicals. I mentioned acid, but there's other chemicals too that may be required for, that DLE process. The resins, these are things that could end up in that reinjection. So reinjection itself is not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet. It might sound closed-looped. It might sound circular. But actually, there's a lot of concern in South America, for example, about the possibility of reinjection and what it would do in terms of reintroducing, or I'm sorry, not reintroducing, but introducing new chemicals into the salt flats. And also, how could that affect potentially the wetlands, the aquifers, the groundwater systems in this broader area? So I think there's still a lot of important questions. And that's why I think there needs to be strong mitigations in place, and there needs to be a strong assessment of cumulative impacts.
Well, there was assessment of those impacts in the Salton Sea through an environmental impact report, which was the earlier version for, controlled thermal resources, Hell's Kitchen. And there were some issues that you worked with, that weren't dealt with. There was a lawsuit. It was thrown out as having no merit. So when the California Environmental Quality Act and the judges are sort of rejecting the community, how's this going to get rectified for the bigger picture that's coming up? There's more.
Yeah.
There's more impact analyses, but just your sort of a final.
Sure. Yeah. So there were a couple different environmental impact reports. One was for energy source minerals before controlled thermal resources, actually, at Hudson Ranch facility. That's different, right? That's actually, in a lot of ways, gets less coverage, but it's almost a more, advanced project, I think, in a lot of ways. Energy source minerals, they're using already infrastructure at the Featherstone plant there at Hudson Ranch that is operated by the geothermal company CERC. And energy source minerals also already has a conditional commitment from the Department of Energy for a loan. It's not finalized yet, but it happened at the very end of the Biden administration. So that environmental impact report was approved by the county in 2021, I believe. Controlled thermal resources, Hell's Kitchen, that's a different project because it's a greenfield project, right? They don't have a geothermal plant yet. They'd have to construct a whole geothermal plant and direct lithium extraction technology as well. And yeah, so there was a lawsuit. Comite Civico del Valle, together with Earthworks, filed litigation. The judge did reject the appeal, but then it's been appealed since then, actually. In early March, it was appealed. So the appeal is still ongoing. And yeah, so there were concerns that we've talked about, water supply concerns, hazardous waste concerns, air quality concerns. Groups like Comite Civico del Valle have been doing a lot of air quality monitoring, kind of pioneering a lot of air quality monitoring, setting an example for that in the Salton Sea region. And so, these are concerns that they're well aware of and they have a strong knowledge of. And really it's about, again, cumulative impacts. I think that precedent that was set by the Atacameños del Altiplano community in the Hombre Muerto salt flat is really important, because this is actually one of the few places around the world where DLE has been in operation for decades, since the late 90s. And that's an example where there has been a really bad water depletion. So freshwater use is a concern. And if we're going to have water conservation programs, fallowing, for example, happening in order to address the drought at the Colorado River, we need to also be thinking about all of these things together, right? What are the different projects in this area that are extractive, both industrial, agricultural, and also water conservation programs that are reducing inflows to the Salton Sea too? There needs to be a more holistic approach to this. And that litigation is not about stopping the Hell's Kitchen project. It's not a kind of lawsuit where they're opposing or halting that project. They understand that there's a lot of enthusiasm for jobs and economic development in this area, and they're hopeful that strong mitigation measures could be in place to control for some of these concerns about water supply, about hazardous waste, and all the rest of it.
Well, I could talk to you for like 2 hours more, but we really need to wrap it up.
Yeah, sure.
Any other points?
I'm still confused. Should we be extracting lithium or not? Because there's the bigger issue of how we're going to move. And so there's some very serious environmental concerns about the extraction process. And yet it is going to be moving forward. Like a freight train, it seems like it is moving forward in all these places. Is there a better way, or is it all just as bad?
What about salt batteries out of China?
Sodium-ion batteries?
Yeah, extending the life to 18 years by injecting compounds that sort of reinvigorates the lithium ions.
Yeah.
I was reading about both of these things out of China.
I think, I'm not an advocate for extraction, but I'm not denying that extraction is necessary for the energy transition, and it's going to take some compromises, but hopefully can be done in ways that are going to minimize the environmental burdens and maximize the community benefits. So that's really what I'm advocating for, no matter what method is actually being used. I think it'd be hard to find an environmental advocate that would tell you that open pit mining is good, right? There's all kinds of problems associated with open pit mining. There's been a lot of serious tailings dams problems. I don't know if you've followed in Indonesia, the nickel mine recently. I had the privilege of visiting this, it's called IMIP. Massive tailings dam failure, and it's contaminating the water system in this whole area of central Sulawesi. So that kind of thing happens with open pit mines. It's not nice. Brine evaporation. There's still, I think, valid concerns about brine evaporation and its impact on the water systems. Okay, but direct lithium extraction, it's not a silver bullet. I hope that it can be done in a sustainable way, but really that still needs to be demonstrated. And sodium-ion batteries, show some promise. They're like heavier than lithium-ion batteries, so maybe they'll be used more for, stationary storage. I think also that they are used in some electric vehicles in China, right? Yeah. But I've heard mixed things about, for example, the flammability. Some people say that sodium-ion batteries are less flammable than lithium-ion batteries. We know about, disasters like at Moss Landing with lithium-ion batteries. But actually, I spoke to a scientist at UC Santa Barbara who is really interested in researching sodium-ion batteries, and she said her lab blew up from sodium-ion battery experiments. So it's not necessarily ready a perfect solution. Yeah. So I hope that that's an alternative. Soda ash itself is an extraction, that's necessary too. Like a lot of that comes from Wyoming. There's got you've got your own problems with sodium carbonate too. But they're different from lithium, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very
Of course,
much
yeah, my pleasure, yeah.
And thank you for your work you're doing.
My pleasure.
Hey, listeners, to check out the extended recording of this show or to explore our other shows, visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, and subscribe to our podcast. This has been Eco Justice Radio and our show, The Lithium Rush, Can the Salton Sea Save Us? Thank you to Dr. James Blair, Preston Arrow-weed, Christian Torres, Dr. Ali Sharbat, and the Pioneers Conference. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. Please connect with us on social media at Eco Justice Radio, SoCal 350, and Wilder Utopia. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. Please connect with us on social media at Eco Justice Radio. If you like what you have heard and you want others to be informed, you know what to do. Subscribe and share the episodes. Project of SoCal 350. The show can be found on all major podcast apps and at ecojusticeradio.org. Executive producer is myself, Jack Eidt, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.